So we are going to move on to the segment of our show that we call Before They Were President or Things We Read on Wikipedia Earlier Today.
Well, I mean, I read it on
Now,
Wikipedia last night, but like since you're 14 hours ahead of me, my last
it's
night
true.
is your today or yesterday or 3 days from now, or I just don't understand how time zones work.
Well, I mean, time is relative. Plus,
It's,
people will be listening to this months after we actually record it, so it gets
yeah,
extra complicated.
time is a flat circle.
Thank you, Matthew McConaughey.
Eh.
So, the first item that we're going to be discussing is that once again, we have a president whose name we have been saying wrong this whole time.
Uh-oh.
His name, his birth name at least, on his birth certificate is not Calvin Coolidge, but it is John Calvin Coolidge.
Interesting that he dropped the first name.
Well, it's just like, well, it's a little like our last president we covered, Ulysses S. Grant,
Yeah.
who, Ulysses was his middle name.
Yeah.
But you know what? Some people had to go by their middle names.
Yeah. I guess. I
All
mean,
right.
my middle name is Gerald, and I went by Gerald when I was a kid because I'm named after my dad. And so, like, if mom yelled Derwin, and then both of us were running, then it would be confusing, right? So we want to know which one of us should be afraid. And then, I went by my middle name, and now I go by Derwin in my civilian life. So whenever my wife and my mom and my dad are all in the same room, and one of them says Derwin, the confusion begins. So,
Well, you have that in common with Calvin Coolidge because he, after his father, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., his mother was Victoria Josephine Moore, and he was born on the 4th of July.
like an American should be.
The only American president of our 46 presidents who has actually been born on the 4th of July, this time in 1872 in Plymouth Notch, Vermont.
Yes.
John Calvin Coolidge Sr. was an extremely interesting, accomplished man in Vermont. Among his many titles, he served in the Vermont House of Representatives and the Vermont Senate, and he was a notary public. A notary public is going to come back and be very important in this history very soon. Let's just keep it simple. Instead of saying John Calvin Coolidge Jr., Sr., all that good stuff, we're just going to call him Calvin. All right, you know what I'm talking about. So this is the actual president guy. Graduated from Amherst College and then apprenticed in Massachusetts before opening up his own law firm. Again, Massachusetts is huge to his story, and him being a lawyer is huge. We're going to move on to a segment on the show that we call Ladies, First, in which we talk about the great women behind the great men. In this episode, we have a heck of a first lady for you. So, Calvin established himself as a lawyer in Massachusetts and met Grace Goodhue, who was also from Vermont. So, they had that in common. Another good sign is that she was an extremely accomplished woman on her own. So, she was a University of Vermont graduate. According to one source, I found she's the first lady to earn a 4-year undergraduate degree.
Hey, that's cool.
And she taught at the Clark School for Hearing and Speech. She taught deaf people how to lip read.
Hey, that's cool.
That's 100% cool. I love it. So she herself was not political, but she was a very altruistic person. She supported the Red Cross, the Visiting Nurse Association, and later on in her life, she supported helping out Jewish European refugees during World War II, which sainthood.
Yeah.
And loaned out her house to the Navy Waves. For those of you who don't know, the Navy Waves, that was the all-female branch of the Navy back during World War II, actually before Vietnam.
They were kind of like, they filled non-combat positions stateside, right? Like that's what the Waves were.
I feel like if I were a better historian, again, we're both C+ historians here, I would know whether or not the Navy Waves deployed. I believe they deployed, but again, they functioned non-combat roles. But it was all female, so this is before the integration of males and females into the military. So good for her. And I love one detail about their courtship Because everything I've read indicates that Grace and Calvin polar opposites. So history has documented Calvin Coolidge as being an extremely boring and direct person, and meanwhile Grace was a very like effusive personality and very engaging. She was very social. But his proposal to her was going up to her and saying, "I am going to marry you."
Oh,
How romantic! I'm
I,
sure you had the exact same approach.
well, we actually kind of talked about marriage for like a year before I like formally proposed. Kind of like, because like I was basically ready to marry her by the third date. Because like you meet somebody, you're like, oh, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I get the I'm going to marry you thing, right?
I
And
am going to marry you. So many similar. But I like that he's from New England, yet my Calvin Coolidge voice is, "I am going to marry you." Um,
well, if a
so
robot was from New England, that's what it would sound like.
I wouldn't be surprised. So it was a successful courtship, as evidenced by the fact that he would go on to be president, she'd go on to be first lady. They had two sons named John and Calvin. Yep, this is further proof in my book that Calvin Coolidge was a robot. His name was John Calvin Coolidge. It's like, honey, what should we name the kids? John and Calvin.
If it works, like let's not reinvent the wheel here. Let's just find some let's check some boxes.
Yeah, it goes with even in his personal life, he had the laissez-faire attitude, which is just sort of like, I don't want to come up with new names. Here's just my first name. Here's my middle name.
I I tried convincing my wife to let us name because we don't have any kids yet, but I tried convincing her to let us name the second born son Magnus Robot Fighter Lester, right, in honor of the 1990s Valiant comic book Magnus Robot Fighter. She said no.
Well, there's always a third kid.
Always a
All
third.
right. So moving back to Calvin Coolidge before he was president. So per Wikipedia, we have a full roster of everything that Calvin Coolidge did leading up to the White House, which includes serving in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, mayor of Northampton, Massachusetts. Could he have picked a state that's easier to pronounce? The Massachusetts State Senate, lieutenant governor, and finally governor. This man did everything for the state of Massachusetts, shy of playing for the Red Sox.
I kind of want you to describe his Massachusetts career in your sort of like hoity-toity high society voice that I enjoy so much.
Are we talking the English or the American?
The American one.
All right. John Calvin Coolidge served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He was mayor of Northampton, Massachusetts. He was part of the Massachusetts State Senate. And guess what? He was also lieutenant governor and finally achieved governor status in 1919. Does that convey the New England regality of what we're talking about?
Sounds like peasant nonsense.
Oh, indeed. But he wasn't a peasant for long. Oh, yeah, by the way, I do appreciate one little detail. So even when he did become governor, he had the two little kids at home. So as governor, he has to live in Boston, the capital of Massachusetts. But he just wound up getting a motel room and like going to work during the week, going back to Northampton during the weekend, all that good stuff.
That's cool.
That's cool. I like that. It's like I can appreciate a parent doing that to make sure that the kids don't get uprooted too often.
Sure.
But as governor of Massachusetts, this is the last Massachusetts president we're covering until, of course, JFK.
That's good. There's too many syllables in that name. Like they should just change it to like rich people land.
Yeah, it's a lot of mush together.
Like
a more articulate man than me could say that.
You could call it Articulate New York. That could be the new name.
What is called Mass?
Mass.
Yeah. But he became a national celebrity for breaking up the Boston police strike.
I'm sorry, I've got one more stupid joke and I'll let it go. So if we're gonna call it Mass, we should change Vermont's name to Volume. Science.
You're a dork.
Anyway, go on. Sorry.
So I took this one instance of standing out, breaking up the Boston police strike. And if you're interested in the Boston police strike, you can do enough research on your own about it. It's long and complicated, but it made him a star in the Republican Party. And just to go over a few more accomplishments, just because he was governor, let's go into it. He pushed for a legislature to give $100 to all Massachusetts veterans from World War One.
That's
You know what?
cool.
We are both veterans. I'll take $100 in 1919 money.
That's like $1,400, right?
Yeah, that's it's better than kicking the pants.
Yeah.
He pushed for the reduced work week for women and children. The Titanic had just sank, so the verbiage was already there.
Yeah.
And publicly vetoed the increase of legislator pay by 50%. How much of a dick move is that? That you spent your entire life in the Massachusetts Capitol, like dealing with like state representatives, all this stuff. And then as soon as you're the boss, you're like, you know what? Oh, 50% pay increase. I mean, I don't think he made many friends, and that's kind of a reoccurring pattern throughout his career.
Yeah.
It was a lot of like getting to the top and essentially getting to the top and then removing the ladder and then laughing maniacally.
Go fuck yourself.
So he stands out amongst rising Republican stars, and he gets chosen to be the running mate for someone else we've covered on this show, Warren G. Harding. I don't know about you, Derwin. I never get sick of talking about Warren G. Harding. If you listen to our episode on Warren Harding, or if you know just basic American history, that it doesn't end well for Harding or anyone in his cabinet.
Yeah. They got caught with their hands in the cookie jar.
Well, cookies are delicious, and oil is lucrative.
Yeah, but you can't like embezzle public funds. And like, you can't have like.
Tell me how I'm going to live my life.
See, I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life. The Supreme Court's trying to tell you how to live your life.
So when he found out about getting the nomination as the running mate for Warren G. Harding, Grace said, "You aren't going to take it, are you?" And his response was, "Well, I suppose I'll have to." Just very direct. This is a reoccurring pattern. Like for the presidents we've covered who had been vice presidents before, it was always kind of like why the fuck not? I kind of love that about that. What's the president going to do? Die in office? LOL.
Several times, yes.
So, as we all know, in 1920, the presidential election went to Harding, who beat James M. Cox, the former governor of Ohio, by a landslide. And as vice president, he was wildly unpopular with the House of Senate. The only real job a vice president has to do is the tie-breaking vote in the House of Senate.
Yeah.
And he never cast a tie-breaking vote.
That's such a sweet gig.
2.5 years that he was vice president, he twiddled his thumbs and collected a paycheck.
Oh my God! I just want to be vice president.
You had one job, Mr. Vice President.
I just want to be vice president so bad. Like that's, if you're going to be a bureaucrat and you want to really lean into the lifestyle of collecting a paycheck for doing nothing, that's the one to do. You just have to like not commit any felony, not get caught committing any felonies, right?
Oh, Derwin, it is way too soon after our Grant episode to talk about corrupt vice presidents. I mean,
I pay attention.
So he did have one unique distinction as Veep, which is that he was the first vice president to regularly sit in on cabinet meetings. And considering how crooked Harding's cabinet was, that must have been entertaining as hell to be a fly on the wall, let alone the vice president sitting in on that. I imagine a lot of the time was just him like kind of taking notes like, okay, if I become president, who am I throwing under the bus?
When this scandal breaks, when this Teapot Dome scandal breaks, it's I am going to testify against everyone. Screw everybody in this room and Congress too. No one gets a pay raise.
So a quote from Senator Edward Ladd of North Dakota said, "Nobody has anything to do with him after this. Of course, he's through," referring to Calvin Coolidge. And those words did not turn out to be true because on August 2nd, 1923, Warren G. Harding was murdered by his wife. I
Ah.
mean, had a heart attack. Yeah, we did not elaborate nearly enough on that conspiracy theory. And as everyone I talked to about it has echoed the same point, which is if in fact Florence Harding murdered Warren, good for her. That is an absolute Arrested Development meme moment if she in fact did it. Good for her.
Yes.
So with our 29th president, Harding, being dead, it comes time for Calvin Coolidge to be notified. We're going to spend so much more time talking about like the little details about before he's president than the actual presidency, but this is amazing. So a telegram comes to his house saying the president is dead. Long live the president, which is you now. So remember how I mentioned that Calvin Coolidge's dad was a notary public?
Yes.
He becomes the first president to be sworn into the presidency by his dad.
Oh, that's so
A little bit of
cool.
trivia in case there were any daddy issues going on. I'm pretty sure that's the well, Dad, I think I did okay for myself moment, and thanks for swearing me in.
That's kind of a cathartic moment. I like that.
I have no idea if there's any daddy issues here going on. If they are, Calvin Coolidge had no emotional range period, so
There's always
he
daddy
did
issues
the
with
oath.
successful guys, Pete.
Well, I mean, which is probably why we're not successful. We both have good dads.
Great dads.
I also like reading that after swearing in, his response was to go right to bed, which is just whatever. I'm
Got a big
the
day
highest
tomorrow.
ranking person in this government. Yeah, it's like I gotta get to my beauty sleep, man.
Yeah.
I'm about to be photographed a lot.
Yeah.
So Mr. Coolidge goes to Washington, and at the exact same time, all of those scandals that we've just been alluding to for the last 5 minutes come to head. So this is 1923. It's the year before the next presidential election. And suddenly we have the Veterans Bureau scandal, in which $200 million were siphoned out of the Bureau of Veterans Affairs.
Holy crap.
We thought the VA was screwed up now. And then the Teapot Dome scandal, and then Harry Daughtry, his attorney general, selling pardons and getting booze to the White House and all his buddies during Prohibition. So things don't look great for this new administration. But to his credit, Calvin Coolidge was adamant about getting an independent investigator to investigate all the many members of the Harding administration who were taking money on the sides. And, we know what happens to Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, who wound up becoming the first cabinet member to ever go to jail. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, the seriousness of the Teapot Dome scandal, it sounds like something that you'd hear on Downton Abbey. It's like, oh, the Teapot Dome scandal. No, that was Watergate before Watergate.
I so enjoy your pretentious voices.
Oh, yes. Would you like the Teapot Dome scandal, everyone? Yeah, so I was gonna say jumps into his presidency, but this is cool what we're talking about. So he just carefully walked and then said, "This is Oval Office."
Well, he's
Calvin
probably like the
Coolidge.
perfect guy at that moment, right? Because everybody had their hands in the cookie jar. And so you have a guy who's just kind of
Doesn't eat cookies.
Doesn't eat cookies, low profile guy, doesn't believe in sugar, probably doesn't even drink caffeine. Like just a really boring, consistent, stable guy. You need the guy that there's so many people indicted and going to prison. You need the one guy who is like, I'm just trying to be an okay person, right? I'm not trying to be great. Because like Calvin Coolidge, his thing was like, I'm not a great man. I just want to be good. And so he was
even that was a little too enthusiastic for him.
Yeah. Like just
it's like
even keel, Cal.
So Calvin Coolidge's presidency was marked for a lot of laissez-faire, which we've alluded to in the past is just the idea of hands-off government, which can be good, but it can also be really bad, which we're going to allude to. And if you listen to the Herbert Hoover episode, or you just have a basic idea of time, you know how that can be very bad.
Yeah.
But he did reduce taxes on 4 separate occasions. So that's good. Let's see. He was the first president to appear in talking film, and Grace also appeared in talking film.
Part of his laissez-faire attitude was an idea called, like they had these like taxation policies at the time called scientific taxation, which is there's like a descendant version of it and sort of like libertarian conservative ideology now where like if you have the lower tax base, then it just generates more revenue because if more people are more free to create more wealth, that additional wealth created will in turn generate more taxes even at a lower rate. That's the theory that kind of Calvin Coolidge's was like his administration was the first to really promulgate on such a scale in that form. And in a lot of ways, he's sort of like the unofficial father of like, he's way more conservative, fiscally speaking, than any conservatives are currently because he was just a really buttoned down, straight laced, boring dude, right? But that's kind of the guy you want. You want a guy that you forget about. You want the guy that just blends into the background and no one cares. Anyway, like I'm fascinated with taxation and like money and wealth and generating
Who
shit like
isn't?
that. Yeah.
I mean, I personally read, manuals from the IRS for fun.
I've actually subscribed to their YouTube channel and watched their videos.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I was kidding, but I actually believe you. So a lot has been made about how fiscally conservative Calvin Coolidge was, but what is not often talked about is how socially progressive he was.
Yes.
Now, if you listen to the Grant episode, I do so many shout outs for previous episodes. Moral of the story, just you don't even need to listen to the whole season. Just listen to one episode and I will reference every other episode we do.
Or you can listen to the whole season and then just forget that last thing Pete said to you guys.
I suppose you could do both. It's
Don't
your
talk
choice. It's a
people
free
out
country.
of listening to our show. What are you doing?
I am sabotaging. But one thing that I had no idea about until we did our Grant episode was that despite the 14th Amendment getting ratified, the indigenous population of America was not guaranteed citizenship.
That's weird.
Which makes no sense. The 14th Amendment says that if you were born in the United States, you were a United States citizen.
Sure.
It was not until 1924 when the Indian Citizenship Act was passed that all of our indigenous population was considered to be American citizens, which now you know.
It's way overdue, but that's it boggles my mind. I think we talked about this before. It boggles my mind that happened a century ago. Like from what I was reading,
less than 100 years ago.
Yeah, from like what I was reading, like like there were veterans that were, but like they weren't citizens by birthright like we are, right? And so they had to almost, they were treated almost like an immigrant population, right? Which, no, you guys were born here. So that's kind of, it rights a wrong.
And among other cool things about Calvin Coolidge, he spoke out on the rights of the Black population in America on multiple occasions. So not a lot of his actions reflect that besides the Indian Citizenship Act in terms of like racial harmony in the country. But you know what? He got a platform. He used it. He spoke out against racism. And one thing I read is that he didn't appoint a single KKK member to his cabinet. It's like, what a low bar that is. This is like, I mean, I would hope all presidents skipped a point. I mean, like, we're eventually going to get to Woodrow Wilson and that can of worms. But
listen, no one in my cabinet has murdered a gypsy. Okay, and I feel like that's a step up.
I mean, it's like progress.
Up, sure.
Anyway, now we're going to get to the real unfortunate legacy of Calvin Coolidge. Because we said something nice about him. No KKK members of his cabinet. Good job. But that laissez-faire approach coincided with the Roaring '20s, this economic boom in the country where everyone's going to become rich, everyone's going to become a millionaire. It's a beautiful time in the country, and boy, that jazz age is just fun. However, he was allowing businesses to operate with little resistance on Wall Street, which was, So later on, after the Great Depression, the Senate Banking and Currency Committee did an investigation and found that half of the $50 billion worth of stocks that were sold during the '20s had been undesirable and worthless.
Oh gosh, that's
People were
familiar.
buying air, and yeah, this is kind of how all major depressions happen, which is just the idea of spending all of that money with nothing to back it up. And in fact, there was a member of his cabinet who I'd like to point out, not part of the KKK, the criteria to make Calvin Coolidge's cabinet, urged him to increase federal controls on private banking and stock trading practices. Can you guess which member of that cabinet that was? And hint, we did an episode on him.
Hoover.
Our boy Herbert Hoover, the man who
Yes.
received the blame for the Great Depression, was the one urging him to use his power as president to just shore things up, check up on Wall Street, make sure that they weren't doing things badly, possibly because he knew he was going to be president someday. And he was like, hey, if you could like keep me from being one of the 20th century's greatest villains, unwarranted, that would be great.
Yeah.
However, it turns out Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover didn't get along, despite the fact that Herbert Hoover is one of the few cabinet members who got to keep his job after the change of power happened.
Yeah. Well, because like
And if I can,
with Wall Street, like, and this is my layman's understanding, but from what I understand, sometimes people like to, like in the '08 crash, right? They kind of do the same, they follow the same patterns, and people get greedy and they forget, right? I'm a big capitalist. I love making money, but also sometimes people get stupid and then they crash the economy about 7 to 10 years. And much like in the 20s, like people would over leverage stock picks, right? They would borrow money with like 10% down. So like let's say you want to buy $1,000 worth of something, you're putting $100 on it, right? And then people would like package those debts together and sell shorts against those debts, saying a short is a bet that this person is going to default on their purchase, right? On their loan to buy this stock. So there's like a derivative of a derivative of a derivative, right? And like you said, they were buying air, right? Like at a certain point, it's like a giant Ponzi scheme and it's a house of cards and the whole thing collapses. And then half the country is unemployed. And everyone's like, what happened? I bet it's that Herbert Hoover guy. No, turns out it wasn't. He was the smartest guy in the room.
he was the only one being like, maybe this is about to explode in all of our faces.
Let's just have one grown up over there in charge. Someone's got to
I
say
mean,
no.
the more I learn about Herbert Hoover, the more I'm like, dude, can I buy you a beer? I
Yeah.
know you're a Quaker and you don't drink, but
Like well, he doesn't drink, but he goes and he fights like in the Boxer Rebellion, and his wife's a badass nurse while he's shooting like the Chinese or something. Like the guy's amazing, right?
and if we do nothing else with this show, if we can rehabilitate the image of Herbert Hoover,
Exactly.
then we've done our job. It's
I
all worth it.
I just want the 6 episode limited series called Hoover. That's all I want.
Return to Hooverville.
Yeah.
All right.
If you know your history,
So
that's not a good thing.
that is a great segue to our next point, which is Calvin Coolidge leaving the presidency. So we finished out Harding's term and then got reelected in 1924, served an additional 4 years. And then, per the custom, he was like, well, I was kind of president twice, so no third term for me. And decided not to run in 1928 and decided to give the job to Herbert Hoover, a man he famously didn't like.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be amazing if the Great Depression was just a revenge plan? If the whole thing was just like he got like mad at Herbert Hoover and he was like, you know what? I'm going to set this guy up to be president and then get him the blame for being like the worst president of all
Yeah.
time because you know what? He cut me off in traffic once. Okay. Traffic is bad enough in DC. So afterwards, he retires back to Northampton, writes some books. For 1 year, he writes a weekly column in the local newspaper. Again, I like how like chill former presidents used to be when they retired. And then died on 5 January 1933, right before Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets sworn in as president. The guy helps set up the Great Depression and then just checks out before it gets really, really bad.
This feels like a
Like this is
Herbert
just
problem.
it was like now it's an FDR problem.
No, it's an
It's just
FDR
like
problem.
my work here is done.
Oh, the Germans look really mad. You got this, Frank. I believe in you. No, but there's one
Yeah.
more thing I want to add before we wrap this up. There's a quote that Calvin Coolidge says is not true, right? But it was a popular story about him. I don't know. You were probably going to get to this, but like I know a fact, so I'm excited to share it. And there's a story where he's at a dinner party, and there's a lady who turns because he was such a quiet, stoic guy, right? He just didn't really talk very much, and she turns to him and says, "I bet my friend I could get you to say more than 2 words tonight." And then he says, "You lose." And I'm like, oh, that's so dry and funny.
Like there's just such a like if Calvin Coolidge wasn't a supervillain, he should have been. He had that sense of humor.
Exactly.
So Calvin Coolidge is not remembered. And if he is remembered, it's for all the jokes we've made at his expense.
Sure.
But the guy has a lot of supporters.
Yeah.
One of those supporters is someone that we may cover someday, but we'll probably further down the line. Ronald Reagan was a huge fan of Calvin Coolidge and decided to honor him by replacing the portraits of John Adams and Harry Truman in the upstairs of the White House with one of Coolidge. He
Oh,
also said that he was an underrated president and he based a lot of his own personal deregulation on Calvin Coolidge's. So even if he was a forgotten president, a president who we'll never forget took some notes from him. So
exactly.
there's that. All right, now we get to the questions.
Well, I have one
After
more question for you, sir. Did we cover his son's death?
we didn't, I thought that was it is worth covering, I suppose. You know what?
Because
Actually,
I
here's
think
how
it
we're gonna.
explains a lot of because like that weren't there like 2 different like Coolidge administrations, one before his son's death and one after, and then the one after he just kind of checked out, right?
Well, I think this is an interesting venue to approach because this is a humor podcast. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about are actual humans.
Yeah.
And a lot of what happened and a lot of the presidents that we write off and whatnot had real human tragedies happen to them. Like in the first episode, we mentioned that William Howard Taft, was famously a not very good president, but his wife had a stroke at the very
Yeah.
beginning of his presidency. That's a little distracting.
Yeah.
And with Calvin Coolidge, tragically, Derwin is right. His son died in 1924, the same year that he was running for re-election.
Yeah.
And history, amongst those who knew him, said that the moment that happened, and his son died at the White House.
Yeah.
So the story behind that was that his one of his sons was playing tennis and developed a blister on his foot that became infected, and he died from blood poisoning. So no parent should have to deal with that, let alone someone who has an all-encompassing job like being president of the United States. So it does paint this picture of someone who is understandably distracted and cannot focus on his work.
Because he blamed himself.
So
Like he said that the boy died because of me, because I chose to be president and I brought them here. And if I hadn't chosen to be president, he wouldn't have played on that field and he wouldn't have gotten blood poisoning. And blood poisoning is when you basically get an infection and it catches your bloodstream. And then you see these like this red and kind of, purple lines going up your body, right? If you ever see that, you think, oh, it's time to go. Because at the time, there was zero treatment for it. It was, well, I hope there's a priest nearby. Like that was the treatment for it, was your last rites, basically. And so from what I understand, after the boy died, he just kind of checked out, right? Like there is, I'm by no means a doctor, but the dude would like sleep all the time. He'd sleep 12 hours a day. Sometimes he slept way more than most presidents. He just kind of ghost walked through a lot of his presidency after that. And that's kind of gave him such a bad name from what I gathered, and gave him a bad reputation in some circles. And, because he starts off as this activist guy and he's like, we're going to taxes and we're going to Native Americans and it's going to be great. And then his son dies and he's like, I am out. Like, and so that's probably for me, that's probably why when his term was up, he just kind of left back to the homestead and wrote Silent Cal Says or whatever his newsletter was called in the newspaper.
In the beginning of the show, we joked about how Calvin Coolidge was a robot, and he was flesh and blood. He was human. And I think if we've learned anything from the past episodes we've done, we'd probably be better off if our presidents were in fact robots.
Yeah.
No human emotion required.
Yeah.
No, just incapacity to feel personal tragedies. Just get the job done.
Exactly.
All right. So after everything we've discussed, Derwin, do you think that Calvin Coolidge deserves a better reputation than what he's got?
Well, in light of what I just said, yes, because it's if you factor in the understand, well, yeah. There's a question between response, you can understand, because I don't have an answer here, but you can understand that while the man suffered such a personal tragedy, his favorite son, he said his son, that the one who died was his favorite son. And so you can
real quick, what kind of parent picks a favorite? As much as I feel for the guy and the tragedy that his family, kind of a dick move to be like, not my favorite. Like, Dad, you have two sons.
Yeah, but what if the other one sucks? Like, you got to back up.
Don't say that.
I mean, this was the 20s.
Think it, but don't say it.
This was the 20s. It was a whole different world.
Like, if my parents were like, we like your sister more than you, I'd be like, I mean, I don't blame you, but you don't say that to my face.
I mean, I haven't met your sister, but she seems pretty cool. I'm just saying.
So yeah, Mom and Dad, if you think, well, Peter's second, and just keep it to yourself.
Yeah, dude, your sister had a TV show. Like, that's pretty cool.
We have a podcast. That's just as cool.
That is just as cool. You're right. But no, I think that, I'm conflicted, right? Because there's a part of me that wants to be sympathetic to a man who suffered such incredible loss. However, he also has a responsibility to the entire nation, right? And to a greater extent, the planet, because America at the time was not the dominant force that it is today, but it was, we were responsible for rebuilding much of Europe after the First World War. And, so what we did really mattered, right? And so if you suffered such a great loss, I understand. However, if you are in a position of responsibility over hundreds of millions of people, you should probably abdicate. So no, I think he's about right. Like, if I'm looking at this from a really harsh perspective, right, just from a real nuts and bolts responsibility, if you're so depressed you can't keep going and you're responsible for the lives of other people, you should either fix your head or go somewhere else. But that's me.
My own opinion is I think he deserves to be remembered.
Yeah.
He did a lot of good. He also set up the Great Depression.
There's that.
And then set up one of our favorite people for failure.
But
I mean, the fact that he still has such a great reputation amongst contemporary conservatives indicates that there are people who deeply respect his politics.
Sure.
And man, we could go even further in this episode, but I'll encourage you all to do research on your own about the fact that as governor of Massachusetts, he was actually very involved and very thorough. But he did have that opinion of state government superseding federal government. So again, that's talking points for you all, the listeners.
That's called federalism, right? And James Madison established that during the founding of the Constitution and the Republic. But that's a podcast for another time.
We have not covered Madison yet, but we will, folks. Stay tuned. So to lighten the mood just a little bit,
I'm such a
next
bummer.
Question.
Oh my God, I'm such a bummer.
We're about to talk about penises, so it's gonna get fun. In honor of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge's running mate, nicknaming his penis Jerry, what do you think Calvin Coolidge nicknamed his penis?
Gangster's Paradise.
I mean, why not?
Because Calvin Coolidge, there's something.
Oh,
there.
You're a nerd.
I am.
My answer is I was gonna say the Roaring 20 Inches. But Calvin Coolidge was very honest, so he would have called it the Roaring 8.
Or it could be the Roaring 2 Inches, but he knows how to use it.
That's what matters.
That's what matters. So, do you think he should be on a zombie survival team?
No, no,
Yeah,
absolutely
no.
not. This is, I think, the first time I've ever said no to this
Yeah.
question because we covered a lot of war heroes.
Yeah.
And here's why I would not want Calvin Coolidge fighting zombies with me. The dude was like a predecessor to the libertarian movement, which means he's going to be concerned about his survival and
Mm-hmm.
not mine.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just going to be like, listen, I have all the tools to fight zombies. You can get your own. And then I get eaten by zombies.
Also, he was like a nerd, right? Like,
He was a scrawny little nerd.
yeah, like you don't
I mean,
want, you want someone who's like Grant. Grant's your guy. I'm sure Grant had all sorts of like PTSD, and well, he did because he was a drunk, and he would drink to kind of like calm his anxiety. And but like that's the guy you want, right? You don't want like the bookworm nerd who's all about laissez-faire taxation policies. That's great in peacetime. It's wartime. We need to like stab people in the face.
all right. So I think that just about wraps up our latest episode. Derwin, any closing thoughts?
Um, no, not really.
You know what? That seems appropriate for talking about a man of few words. No, not really.